Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Jim Rugg.
I'm Ed Piscor.
And I'm very excited for our guest today, Ed, an editor who began at Camiko, spent 25 years working from assistant editor to executive editor at Vertigo Comics through the 90s and 2000s, opened up an imprint at IDW Black Crown, and has also taken no time off and continues to put together books and edit and publish books through crowdfunding and online digital distribution. Welcome to the show, Shelly Bond.
Thanks for having me.
So, Shelly, let's start with the crowdfunding and the self-publishing stuff that you're doing right now, beginning with a new project that you just published recently, Insider Art. Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Insider Art. Let me think. Insider Art. Oh, yeah, this thing. This is a mock print version of a digital compendium that is currently available on Gumroad. And you'll see this a few times. Basically, the short story is that the pandemic happened. We were all quarantined, and I'm sure you guys felt the same way. We all were kind of panicking. There was tons of vitriol on Twitter and in the comics industry. And I just was like, we got to kick this. We got to nip it in the bud, and we have to join forces and do something for the greater good. So I called a retailer named Jen King, who has a few shops in Texas. And I said to Jen, let's create something to raise money for female and non-binary comic book retailers. Let's look after our own. And she was up for it. So I reached out to 7 other editors because, let's face it, I could have done it myself, but I think it would have taken me a year and I would be completely gray and possibly not even alive. So I hit up a few other editors and I came up with a really basic conceit, which is insider art, outsider art for when you're stuck indoors. It seems kind of obvious, but in the beginning, I was playing on the outsider art as a theme. And it seemed kind of cool to like have a house, give each editor a different room, and pretty much say, look, you've got 25 to 30 pages, have at it, just curate and edit the hell out of whatever you want. Make sure it's comics, make sure it has a little bit of games and crafts and single illustrations and prose. And I said I'll be the managing editor and the creative director because I've been trying to build my design and art director portfolio. So I thought if I edit a section and if I'm sort of overseeing it, or the all-seeing eye, as you can see, then there'll be some cohesion. And yeah, we managed to wrangle 142 female and non-binary writers and artists and letterers and colorists from all over the world, from India, from South Africa, from Canada, from the UK, you name it. And yeah, we put together what is a compendium of comics and crafts and cats.
I think it was a couple of days ago, actually, where you were printing that galley copy up yourself and binding it. And I was hoping Jim Rugg saw that thing, man, because I was very impressed by, the hand stitched quality of that sucker. And also, I was so thrilled that that you have that instinct to still like want to feel the actual book in your hand and see how thick the pages are and shit. Because like whenever I print up or I have a new book sort of in the can and it's out there ready to get published or whatever, I will take a look at like other books that are exactly like 285 pages and just like take a look at an X-Men book that's that thick or something, be like, okay, my book is going to be that thick whenever it's time. Do you do that with a lot of your projects?
Always. In fact, I'm such a print purist, and doing this digitally was a first for me. I thought it was really a cool exercise in terms of actually physically assembling it. You know, I'm a tactile person, and I always have my own dummy book anyway. But I got to be honest with you guys. We put it up on Gumroad. It's a suggested donation of $10 for 270 pages. I mean, legit, like a summer's worth of fun. And we just weren't getting a lot of people buying it. And I think I'm going to say part of it is probably because there's donor fatigue. It took us 3 months to put it together. We were working on it nonstop, but a lot of the creatives and a lot of the editors had day jobs. So, you know, in homeschooling. So people were very busy. And while I still think we got it like assembled in record timing, I just think like the state of the world right now is so iffy, and a lot of people are tapped out because there have been so many worthwhile causes. So I have to confess, I took a flag from Jim Rugg, and I thought maybe I should do a product shot. Maybe I should assemble my own homemade with a houndstooth gaffer tape spine, Jim.
I love it.
You love that.
Very much.
I assembled it. It helps to have a good friend who is in charge of the print shop. So it was almost affordable to put this together myself. And yeah, I mean, it's delicate, so I'm not going to lend it to like the neighborhood kid. But wow, it is substantial. And I thought perhaps if I put it up on Twitter or social media and I showed people what they'd be getting for $10, that perhaps we'd get more donations, because every single cent that we earn is going to the Insider Art Female and Non-Binary Comic Book Retailers Fund. And it's just our pleasure to do that. It's a way to give back. And we're going to have this up for at least the next 5 months. But I want to tell you about something else that's cool. This is a 3-prong initiative. So in case you guys didn't do your homework, we've been doing an eBay auction through Jen King's Facebook comic book shopping network. So for the past 2 months, Jen and so many generous people have donated things from their comic book collections, like signed copies of rare hardcovers, or you know, anything they wanted to donate. I actually donated a few old statues that I dusted off from my garage. And we've been raising money to just sort of have a base. And so that's the second part of the initiative. Third part, I'm just going to put it out there, is this, which is a fabric jam. I know that you guys noticed the wallpaper, you know, on the inside the book here. I know you guys are big fans of doing that in your books. And we thought we'd do a fabric jam, which is basically like a collection of cats. My strategy when I started to cold call people in comics, of course, I hit up some of my favorite people like Cecil Castellucci, who I think Jim knows or has heard of a little bit. But I hit up the usual suspects like Becky Cloonan, who we all know is a rock star. She donated not only an amazing cat, but she donated a whole page of a how-to craft, how to wallpaper your house, essentially. But when I called people, I knew that people were busy, and I also knew a lot of people were depressed. So I said, look, if you can't donate your time to write and draw a story, would you be able to just illustrate one cat? And so I challenged people to just take a piece of 4x4 paper and send us a cat. And so in doing so, we not only have 3 different cat jams, as you can see here, we also are auctioning off the cat originals in the coming month on the Comic Book Shopping Network. So there are 3 ways you can contribute to a terrific cause. And yeah,
well,
people are going to be into it.
I first of all, great cause. Obviously, we love comic shops, so very awesome in that front. You know, and we've been talking a lot since the beginning of the quarantine of the value of just making something in this time, doing something with your time, and also the value of working to kind of combat the potential depression that you're describing. So I think all that stuff's great. I didn't realize you did the design on this book, Shelley. I'm amazed by how good it looks. I've been reading more comics on my iPad, and it's just beautiful. The color looks great. The layout looks great. The variety of content I'm very impressed with, as you've already said, 270 pages for, a recommended $10, and a mix of cartoonists that we know and love right next to cartoonists I've never seen before that are kind of equally amazing in some cases. Some of my favorite parts were people I've never heard of before. So I would recommend that to anybody watching. We do a lot of showing off new cartoonists, new books that we find. And I would say this is right in line. Insider Art is right in line with a lot of the stuff that we show off on this channel. So congratulations on all of that. And hopefully this is something that builds and, you can continue to get the word out through a variety of means. Abby James?
Yeah, Abby James is a rock star.
I first came in contact with her at Cab in Brooklyn a couple years ago, and I've been following her online, dig her art. It's really cool. Whenever an artist I like, I see you pick up on that artist. So pretty cool.
Well, I actually stumbled upon Abby just through the Cala Arts Festival back in the beginning part of the year. And I've only been freelance editing since last fall when we had to shut down Black Crown. And I picked up her Lizard Daddies mini comic from Silver Sprocket, who I think are doing terrific things. I think Avery Hill Press and Silver Sprocket are my two favorite publishers right now. And I saw Abby's work, and honest to God, I couldn't wait to work with her. So part of the ulterior motive of me putting together Insider Art was so that I could actually give her a job. But I have to confess, it was a little bit weird to call her up and say, hey, I want to work with you. I think you're super talented, but I can't pay you. It's for a project where it's donations only. And she was like legit so cool. She was like, I'm in. I love the cause, and I really would love to contribute something. So she not only did her own 3-page story that she wrote and draw, but she also did the chapter title for my section. I actually, I demanded the garage because, of course we have all different rooms. We've got a bedroom and an attic and a craft room and a bathroom, which I certainly did not want to tackle. I didn't even want to be tempted. I thought for sure that everybody would just send like fart jokes, but I have to give props to Nicole Boos, who is the editor of that section. And she turned what could have been just like, a joke fest into a place of self care and self medication in terms of things you can do to like, facials and exercises, anxiety and stress relieving techniques. So, wow, she really blew us away with what she was able to curate for that section. But I want to show you Abby's title card for me, because I challenged each of the editors to come up with their own design for their chapter headers. So this was mine. And I'm sure even Ed knows that the reason why I wanted the garage was so I could have a garage band and so I could salute the Clash. Because whenever I have a chance to remind people that, Joe Strummer is my hero, I will do so.
I see that London Calling banner in the background there.
Yes.
Oh, that? Oh, I didn't know that was there. Sorry.
Did you find that because you were working with different editors, did they bring in artists that you had never seen before?
Absolutely.
That's really cool.
One of the things that Jim knows very well from working with me for a long time is that I have a particular method to my madness. I call it organized chaos. I call it master control. I like to have my thumbprints on everything. But something that I was taught long ago from an editor named Lou Stathis, who worked at Vertigo for a short time, but he gave me the best advice. I've always been the kind of editor to just charge in. I want to make the kind of books I want to read. I want to make sure that every part of the comic has like TLC and supreme attention, but I don't want to suffocate people. And Lou Stathis once said to me, don't forget that sometimes the best thing you can do as an editor is take a big step back and breathe and just like celebrate what it is. Don't overdo it. It's like overworking a painting, I think. That was like the best advice I think anyone ever gave me in the 90s, because I think I had, being a young enthusiastic editor, I kind of wanted it to be my way or the highway. So I think over the years I've kind of chilled a bit, and that sticks with me, what Lou said. And so with this book in particular, it gave me a chance to collaborate with other editors, and I gave them a very loose set of parameters. So I didn't want them to feel like I was going to just like strangle them, which isn't to say that I did letter quite a few of the stories, and I did fix a lot of nasty ligatures, and I tamed a lot of kerning because I'm obsessed with that now. Now that I taught myself how to letter, look out. Todd Klein has Eisner Awards that are trembling right now in his New Jersey studio, and they should be, because I'm coming for them eventually.
One thing I want to make note of, and thank you for all the stuff you've been doing lately. There's going to be links in the video directly below for the Gumroad, for the eBay stuff, for everything. So
Great.
I want the audience to make note of that. But you said that you just pretty much got started in the freelance space in terms of editing. And what are the services that you provide specifically? Because this is kind of an invisible art to a lot of consumers and comics readers. Like, editor's kind of an ethereal occupation to some people.
Yeah. I used to say it was the greatest job that nobody knows about, and I want to keep it that way because editing is what I was born to do, and comic book editing is in my bones for life. So I used to joke and say it's the greatest job you've never heard of, but what I love about it is that it's changed so much. You know, since comics, we go through these periods, and I know you've discussed this on the show a lot, where suddenly everyone discovers comics for 10 minutes because of the wave of superhero movies that come out. And we go through this, like, you know, this cycle where they're very popular. And, you know, you guys remember the 80s boom, a lot of the black and white books, the first creator-owned books. So editing, to me, is an art form. And I could talk about that for days. It's a craft, it's an art and a science. And it is not for the lightweight or the faint, because you have to be able to hire the right people and fire the right people on demand. And you have to know what you want, and you have to be able to apply yourself and keep everything moving forward, keep every person on the team abreast of what's going on, and hit your marks, get the book out on time, looking as great as it can look. I think in today's landscape, sadly, so many of the big companies are pushing out their elder statesmen, you know, their core editors. And so there's no training anymore. So I think a lot of assistants and associates don't even know about the craft, and they're more like facilitators, and they're reacting to their bosses or even their publishers, who are rewriting scripts and, you know, and art directing art without any knowledge of perspective or horizon lines, or, you know, the general information that you really need to know. You don't need to be a great artist to be a great editor, but you need to talk the language. So you better brush up on your brush and pen skills. You better understand what you're talking about. That's how people will respect you. And I think that's something that's so lost in today's market, and it's sad. It breaks my heart, but it's another reason why I'm working on a memoir, because I have a particular way of editing, and it doesn't work for everyone, and that's okay. But I just want to make sure that I put it on record, so that at the very least my son understands what I've been doing for 30 years and doesn't think I'm weird or lame like he does right now.
I don't know if you can ever change your kids' ideas on that. You always hear celebrities and sports stars talk about how their kids they're just not impressed, you know? Oh
yeah, right. I can't. But thank God, at least our son, I'll give him props, because the two things that we love in our house are music and comics. And so, you know, the fact that Spencer's dad is my favorite comic book artist that I tricked into marrying me, you know, it's not enough. I mean, Spencer really can draw quite well, but of course, you know, we read comics to him when he was little, and he has a great bookcase full of great comics like Street Angel and Shameless Plug and Hip Hop Family Tree, and, you know, a lot of terrific comics. He's just not into them. He likes video games and he loves music. So he's a drummer, he plays guitar and bass, and he's actually a counselor this year. He's 15 and he's finally making some real money working at the music academy where he actually goes to school. And yeah, so that's a cool thing. But comics, forget it. Just not into them.
Shelly, I consider you and Phil to be what I would call very cool parents. And I always wonder, because rebellion is, you know, that's human nature. And I always wonder how a child who has cool parents is going to rebel. And I think, you know, stop me if I'm the first one to tell you, but I think your son might become star quarterback of the football team or something like that.
Well, I can guarantee you that's not going to happen because he's like about 112 pounds. He's like skinny like a bass player. So thankfully that won't happen. He did play basketball for a while, but now sports are not his thing. But if he wants to be an accountant or if he wants to, make millions of dollars being, famous in a different way, I'm okay with that. And who knows, maybe he'll get back into comics when they're not like surrounding him all the time and in his face. But we hope he will, but we're actually super cool with him doing his thing. We gave him a guitar, an electric guitar on his 8th birthday. And that's the one thing I like to impart for every parent or every aunt or uncle or every friend. When your kid is 8 years old, give that kid an electric guitar and see what happens. And I guarantee you something exciting will happen from that.
That's hilarious. I have a niece with way too much energy, and I think it would be the greatest thing ever. We always joke about getting her things that make noise. An electric guitar in her hands, it would be the ultimate. So hopefully my brother and sister-in-law aren't listening in on this because it feels like that's the perfect gift.
Also at that age, they have smaller guitars now and they're really not expensive. They have a 3/4 inch guitar, which is what we bought Spencer, which is now one of the guitars I like to use. And they also have a 1/2 inch, which is really tiny, but they're like $100. You can get a mini amp. And you know what? You can get the headphones for your niece, Jim. And then that way your siblings won't be angry with you for like destroying their eardrums.
That would defeat the purpose.
No headphones. The headphones are not going to be a part of the gift that I give.
Shelly, I want to talk about your career.
Yes.
Can we get deep?
We haven't had anybody on here from Camiko. So we were wondering if you could tell us any stories about Camiko. You mentioned like that 80s comics in the 80s. And I think of Camiko as one of those indie creator-owned kind of interesting companies, but we haven't heard any stories about it. So you started your career with them?
I did. Yeah, I was really lucky. The short story is that I was a film student. I went to Ithaca College, loved arty film, British film, wanted to become an auteur, and move to London and become famous, by the time I was 25. Well, that clearly didn't happen. I sent 212 resumes out when I graduated school, and I received 2 rejection letters and nothing else. So I decided to move to Philadelphia. And I told my dad I would get a job in a month or he could actually come, yank me back home because Philadelphia was the closest city to my hometown. I got into comics in college. I had a screenwriting class and our teacher showed us Empire Lanes by Peter Gross to explain storyboarding. And I thought that was really cool. I didn't even know comics were still made. I mean, I read a few Archie comics when I was a kid and I loved the Peanuts. But I didn't even know comics were made, and I definitely didn't know there were comics that did not feature superheroes and women running around in bathing suits and high heels, because that really offended me at the time. And I thought that's just, the sexual objectification of women offends me. That's horrible. Why would I want to read it? But there was a kid in my class, in my screenwriting class, who said, if you like this comic, you should come to the comic book store because it's like an amazing time to get into comics. And that kid was Will Dennis. I eventually hired him at Vertigo. I sort of paid him back because without him tapping me on the shoulder to show me that comics could be arty and cool and that were essentially fine art, I might not have really gotten into this as a career. So I think I paid him back and then some by hiring him when he was like 30 something to be an assistant editor. But back to Camiko. I went to the comic book store. I picked up Grendel. I picked up Hellblazer #1. I picked up Elektra Assassin and Love and Rockets. And I think Love and Rockets and Grendel blew my mind. Just completely got addicted to both books. And I was probably most comfortable as an editor and loved editing tape and film. So I thought, I can't write, I can't draw. Maybe what I know about editing tape and film, I can apply to comic book editing. I didn't really know, but I thought, I'm going to try. because my dad always raised me to like, just be fearless, do what you want. He was a frustrated musician who inherited his dad's dry cleaning plant. And so he was always, I always felt like he took one for the team. You know, he always had a band, and he always had a dance band because he was like into big band music. But he always said, like, just do what you want to do, make it happen, like make your hobby your job, just be happy. So I took that to heart. And when I moved to Philadelphia, I was already hooked on comics at that point. It was a year after I discovered them. Well, believe it or not, my local comic shop, Fat Jack's Comic Crypt, was a block away from my apartment. So I went there to pick up my weekly stash, and the manager said, hey, Camiko is nearby. If you're looking for a job, send them your resume. They're looking for an editorial assistant. So I was like, okay. I sent my resume in, and sure enough, Diana Schutz called me, and I had an interview. I went in, and Diana was a tough boss. I've talked about her a lot, and she's heard me talk about her. And she said, I've said pretty accurate and nice things about her, but she knows that she was tough. And so let me just say this. She gave me the best foundation. Number one, she hired me, and I'm always grateful for that, because the person that gives you your first break, no matter what, you know, whether you work with them for 6 months, or in this case, about a year and a half, without that person, you're not in. So every time I see her at San Diego Comic-Con, I always make sure to go thank her, buy her a drink if we're at a bar, or, you know, at least just take a couple of moments to say, hey, thanks. And it's amazing how few people know to do that. And I'm glad I'm able to say that to you guys, because I'm sure you guys legit like believe that and feel the same way. Like, that's huge.
Yeah, it's something we often recommend, even people that aren't in the industry, you know, just as a fan. If this work really touched you in some way, you do want to reach out to these people and let them know the impact that it's had. You know, I mean, we lose comics people, it feels like, all the time, you know, and you want to say this to them while you have that chance. So
Totally.
And by the way, I should say now, you know, for people watching at home, Shelly is the editor that gave me my first mainstream job, my first job that had, you know, money attached to it in comics, you know, and big exposure with the Plain Janes while you were at Vertigo. So anybody that doesn't know that, but I'm glad to hear Diana Schutz, a little bit of mention of her. That's somebody whose name has come up on the show, but we haven't talked to, but certainly another person with an incredible legacy in comics. And I believe she went from Camiko to Dark Horse.
She did.
Was her next big stop.
Yes. And so that was interesting. So when I came in, I was hired as the editorial assistant, which meant I get to answer phones and I get to stuff comp packages, which was A-okay with me. I mean, it was my first job out of college. I was 22 and I was going to take over the world, but I knew I had to learn the ropes. And so I was so lucky because I didn't study English hardcore. Took basic classes. I wasn't a reader as a kid. My sister was, and I didn't want to be anything like my sister. So she took Spanish. I took German. I wasn't a reader. So I needed I had a lot of catch up to do. And Diana always says that I scored the highest on the editing test, which surprised me because I wasn't an English major or an English lit major. But she'll always say that to me when we talk about the early days. But she taught me so much. And I think the number one thing she taught me that I love to stress is she taught me about ownership. Camiko was one of the first creator-owned comic book companies. And Diana was very territorial about her work, and rightly so. I mean, she worked with some of the best writers, Matt Wagner, who, by the way, I think taught me more about storytelling and graphic design than almost anyone in comics, because he let me ask questions and I looked over his shoulder, and sometimes my questions were ridiculous. And that guy was always 100% happy to share his opinions, his recommendations. I still go to him for like just book recommendations because we have very similar taste in prose fiction and especially crime noir and mystery. But he was so generous with his time. And I'm going to start giggling because Jim knows that I've been working on my memoir, Filth and Grammar. And I wrote a section about Camiko that's actually told in a comic, a 5-page comic story. And part of my early days at Camiko, I sort of had my first art crush, which for the record never went anywhere. But I blushed every time I picked up the phone and somebody said, "Hey, Shell," because it was Matt Wagner and my knees knocked. I had the biggest crush on Matt. And he just was the coolest guy in the world. He not only was an exceptional draftsman and a just profoundly gifted graphic designer, but he was into the Clash and the Jam. So if he wasn't married to Diana's sister, I was certain we would have had a future together. And again, it was all for fun. Nothing happened, but it was really, it was part of my formative years of just, learning from him and learning the craft from also Rick Taylor, who was the art director at Camiko. Because when Diana and Bob Schutz, Bob Schreck, who I'm sure some people have called Bob Schutz over the years because they weren't married, when they left Camiko about a year and a half after I started, they split for Dark Horse, and the owners of Camiko came to me and they said, "Look, we're devastated that they left. Would you like to be the editorial department?" And I was like 23 years old, and I was like, hell yeah. So they gave me a raise. I went from earning $13,500 a year to earning $16,000. I had a reverse commute from Philadelphia. So I took a 52-minute train ride and walked 2 miles every day to get to Norristown, Pennsylvania, to a dilapidated house, because Camiko was owned by 2 brothers. One brother was Phil Lasorda, who was just this gentle giant. He was a comic book writer and artist who did a book called As. Do you guys remember As?
Yes.
It wasn't one of the more famous. It wasn't like Bill Willingham's Elementals, but Phil was an artist who ran a company, and his brother, Dennis Lasorda, read comics, but he was a physical therapist. So the dilapidated house had one side, which was Camiko, and the other side, which was a physical therapy office. So you can only imagine the soundtrack all day. You would hear like the physical therapist going, "Lift your legs up," or 1, 2, 3, clank, clank, of like all of the weight machines all day long. And then you would hear just like people making funny comic book noises, like Rick Taylor, who was the art director at the time. He taught me everything I know about color theory, about letraset. I learned about burnishing letter columns. I learned, what a sans serif font is. He really showed me the ropes about like the nuts and bolts of the craft of comics. And he was the greatest mentor I've had in comics across the board. He commuted with me from Philadelphia. So we spent so much time not only talking about comics, and he started at First Comics. So he knew so many legends like Joe Staten, and so many people like Jill Thompson was his best friend. I learned a lot from him, just hanging out with him and commuting with him. And he also loved to sing, and we both sort of got into music, and he loved Roxy Music. So I'll always cherish my memories of working with him for the year and a half before Camiko ended, because we did our best, but the ship still sank, sadly.
Were you there to the end?
I was there until Andrew Rev took over. And yes, seeing 2 companies sort of having their wallpaper peeled off, and the very floorboards dismantled is hideous. It's a terrible thing to watch. But the best thing about that is that you can always rebuild. And if there's one thing I'll say about comics, I'm unflappable. There's negativity is just not like part of my jam, as they say. I just can't go there, because I've seen people rise and fall in comics. I've seen companies rise and fall. Once you can take out the garbage, and by garbage I just mean the trash people and the bad habits, the good people stick around, and the good people help lift you up.
Do you know much about the genesis of Camiko? The rumor is that the company was started by those guys who I guess the Lasordas were part of it, but there were some others who
Yes.
would go around to conventions, get a table, and this is at the height of like the Howard the Duck movement, and they would draw duck versions of characters and stuff for money, and that was like the seed money to begin the first primer or primer comic.
Yep.
That's true.
I know a little bit. Jerry Giovinco, I think, was one of the early founders. I can't recall the other person. I never met them. They weren't there at the time. I started there in '88, so I heard the same stories. I don't really know much other than it was like a family-run company. And yeah, I feel like it was really a shame. I mean, the fact that Bill Willingham, became a huge superstar years later, I have to say, that was always my evil plan. And I'm sure Jim will realize this, but I was the very last editor of the Elementals. And as someone who wasn't a superhero person, the Elementals was the book that actually made me shut up and take notice about what you could do with a superhero trope. And I just thought Bill was a genius. And I also loved his artwork. And I knew that if I ever worked for another comic book company, I was going to look him up, even though all the stories you've heard were true, that I had to chase him across the country because he would disappear. He was like, he lived in Texas for a while, and then he lived in a van, and he was just driving around the country, and I needed to get scripts out of him. So there was a point in time where we hired one of his friends to be a detective so we could find him, so we could actually get the scripts and actually make the comics. So Bill, I think, always thought of me as that pesky little kid, because to look at me at that time, I was 23, but I looked like 14. So I was this goth girl right out of college. So of course he looked at me like, I don't have to listen to you. But many years later, we reconnected when I was working at DC, and I saw him at one of the DC parties. It must have been for either Christmas or a convention. And I tapped him on the shoulder. I said, "Hey, remember me?" And he was really taken aback. I don't think he remembered me at all. But he was happy to talk to me because I had just taken a job at Vertigo, and I was determined to work with him again.
That's one of the great tragedies, that there isn't easy access to those Elementals books, because Jim and I, we come after that basically, and our sort of elder comic fans that we looked up to would mention the Elementals. It seemed insurmountable at the time because you had to go back and get those back issues, and the speculator market was on, so those back issues cost a lot of money. And now through whatever rights issues, there's no trade paperbacks. There's nothing that we could get to see exactly how great those comics are, unless we want to hunt down those individual issues, and some of them are pretty expensive.
Oh yeah. Well, we can offline. We can talk. We can make some trades. I've got a nice stash of Elementals comics, some signed. I cherish them. They're bagged and boarded. They're just foundation for me and fundamental. And it's a shame. It's a part of comics history that I really hope we can bring back soon. But there's always this, Jim and I can go in your basement, Ed, and we can put together our own, we can, instead of the houndstooth, we can come up with another, maybe a Ben-Day dot pattern, Jim.
Or that square, I always associate that square book trade that Camiko would have, that grid.
Yes.
Some grid, kind of grid spine on there.
Love it. Let's do it.
So after Camiko, your next stop in comics is at DC and Vertigo specifically, right?
Yes. After Camiko ended for me, Andrew Rev came in and he said he was taking the whole outfit to Chicago. And I was like, check, please. I'm gone. I wasn't going to move to Chicago, especially with someone that, I trust my first instincts. And as an editor, you have to trust your gut. You can't be wishy-washy. And my gut said, no, thanks. So I actually stayed in Philadelphia, and I decided to try to flex my film and television and audio degree. And I worked for a small film and video production company for a while. And then I also worked in casting. But I missed comics a lot. and my colleague Rick Taylor was working at DC, and he was running the production department. And I'll never forget, I was at my casting job where, strangely enough, I was based in Philadelphia, but I was procuring auditions for kids and adults in New York City to audition for commercials and theater and musical theater productions. So that's when I started tap dancing again, because I had to get these kids into auditions for musical theater. And I couldn't remember what a shim sham was. I couldn't remember how to shuffle off the buffalo. And I thought, if I'm going to tell these kids they're going to need to do a double, triple time step, I better remember what I'm asking. So I actually joined a tap class with some of the kids, and then I got hooked on it again because I did it as a child. So I was getting to know New York City by sending people to auditions. And so I would talk like I knew the streets, which I visited a couple of times. I discovered Fiorucci in 1978 when I went to see Annie, but I didn't know it. So strangely enough, I got that phone call from Rick Taylor. He said, "Hey, Karen Berger is looking for an assistant editor, and I hear she's down to the last two. Send me your resume, be the wild card." And I went, "What? Okay." And so while I was at work, I remember I had my resume handy, but I did a cover letter where I took a marker and I just drew a big star on it. And I did like a Ben-Day dot pattern. I had like Zipatone or Sharp Pad with me because I had just finished doing like a Christmas card for my boss, who was the casting director. That's how I would make extra money. I was doing calligraphy and I was doing like cards, like greeting cards, just basic stuff. I faxed that cover letter and the resume to Rick Taylor. He gave it to Karen Berger, and he called me in for my first interview. So yeah, that's where it began. And then she asked me for some writing samples, and apparently I got the job because I was the wild card. I kind of blew the other two people out of the running. I never found out who they were, and the rest is history.
And this is around 1993, which, again, for people fans of the show, huge year in comics history. It's kind of like the apex of that speculator bubble.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the collapse follows. But I was always interested. I was glad when I heard you're writing memoirs, because I feel like you're in the epicenter of comics through this very exciting decade of the 90s. And so what's that like in 1993 to walk into the DC offices? What's that climate like? What are you experiencing? What do you remember from that?
It was magical. I had my interview at the end of November of 1992, and Karen said, "I want to hire you, but you have to start in 2 weeks." And so I was like, "Okay, I'll just move here in 2 weeks." So of course that wasn't a problem for me. I called my parents, and they were like, "What?" But fortunately, I do come from a family that's like, "Okay, let's get it done." So my mom and I drove into New York, and we walked a 6-block radius around DC Comics, which at the time was at 1325 Avenue of the Americas. And I took the cheapest apartment, which was in Hell's Kitchen at that time, which was not a really pretty place to live, but I found a place that was rent stabilized that had a doorman. And I took a 3rd floor apartment, and I knew I was just going to be working 24/7 because I knew what working in comics was like. So I figured I'm going to just spend my entire life from now on walking 2 blocks to work during the week, but weekends I was just going to hit downtown. And that's exactly what I did. So I started, I think it was December 12th, 1992. And the first day I walked into DC Comics, I'm introduced to Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean. So you can imagine, that was just like, what? So yeah, I think I've said before, my life began when I started that day. It was right before Vertigo launched, and I was the last editorial person in the door. So I'll always thank Karen for that. Like she also gave me a shot. And I have to say, it's pretty impressive that my first 2 bosses in comics were badass women. And I really appreciate that. The industry can be so incredibly cruel. And I just want to say that there was nothing like coming into a men's locker room, because let's face it, the only other comparison I can give you is what Cindy Whitehead tells me it was like being in like the world of skateboarding. You know, when you're in a male dominated industry, it's really tough to be a woman and to get a chance. And so I was really lucky that I came in at a time where Karen had already proved herself. You know, she turned what was called the Burger books at the time, Swamp Thing and Hellblazer and other books that she liked to edit, into what became Vertigo. And I think Jeanette Kahn was one of her biggest champions, and Jeanette was certainly my biggest champion. So in addition to Karen, I always like to give a shout out to Jeanette Kahn, because she was the reason that Fables was a big hit. And I'm grateful to those people for giving me a chance and for believing in me. You know, it's one thing to kind of just to get that break, but when you prove yourself and when you have people around you that like keep saying to you, okay, what else do you have? Who challenge you? You know, that's priceless. And I hope that what I'm doing with projects like Insider Art, where I'm giving newcomers a shot, you know, and when I go to Thought Bubble and I review portfolios for two days, 8 hours a day, I'm doing that because I really care, because I want to pay it forward, and because I really appreciate all of the chances and all of the opportunities that people gave me. I think that's something that's lost in comics right now. And I really hope we can change that, because we can be better. I've seen the industry be better. We go again through these ebbs and flows where, you know, we can look at the marketplace, we can compare it to politics, where you have 4 years of great strides, and then you have 4 years of going back to the Stone Ages. We have to be better in comics. We have to do better. We've got to take out the trash. It's sometimes as simple as that, because there are a lot of people who don't have your best interests in mind, and they will step on your neck. But there are so many more of us like you guys. We have to stick together and make sure that the people in the trenches and a lot of the people coming into comics know that there are good people out there who just want to tell great stories on paper and digital sometimes.
What were a lot of your responsibilities right when you got in the door with DC? And what was the first singular kind of editorial credit that you had with DC?
Well, when I first started, Karen knew that I actually had experience as a full editor. She actually called Matt Wagner, and Matt, I'll give Matt more props. And to Matt's wife, Barb, I swear to God, I still do not carry a torch for Matt. I know I've talked about Matt a lot. I'm still madly in love with my favorite comic book artist and husband, so no worries. But Matt was the one that said to Karen, she's a good kid. She works hard. Give her a shot. Because at that time, when Diana left, you know, there was some animosity, I think. And I don't know if Diana gave me a glowing review, to be honest, but Matt did. And Karen and Matt were quite close, because Matt and Steve Siegel were working on Sandman Mystery Theater. So one of the books I got to work on right from the get-go, I was the assistant editor on Sandman Mystery Theater with Guy Davis, what a phenomenal storyteller, an innately gifted storyteller, right?
Yeah, big Guy Davis fan for sure.
Yeah, he was just terrific and a hell of a nice person. So I got to work on that, which was amazing. I'd worked with Steve Siegel also at Camiko, and I'll name drop Mike Allred, just because one of my favorite Camiko stories was when I had to answer the submissions. And Mike Allred sent quite a few art submissions. He was based in Germany. He was a DJ. He was in the Army. And I was also a college DJ. And so, of course, you know, his package came in, and I would see, you know, he'd have all of these like comments about like being a DJ, and also all these drawings that look like Bowie. So it broke my heart that I was told to give him a rejection letter. But I would always write something personal, like, I know this is going to bum you out, but you're so talented, and I bet you like the Thin White Duke. And so we kind of got to know each other as friends through the submissions pile and through the rejection letters. So he's my first friend in comics, and I can legit say he's like my best friend in comics. I love him and Laura to pieces and their whole family. And he was really like, he and Joel Thompson, I think, were my first friends. And I met Jill through Rick Taylor working at Camiko and through her work on Elementals. So it's nice to be able to say that. And Steve Siegel, of course, did a Grendel Tales story with Ho Che Anderson. Ed Pisker, I was hoping you were going to mention that. I know we had that little back and forth when you were interviewing Ho, and I fell to my knees when Ho's artwork came in for that Grendel Tales issue written by Stephen T. Siegel. And I still to this day stand by the greatest line in comics, which is the final line of that issue, which is, "At least I know that I am not Grendel." I just thought, wow, that's how you write comics.
Shelley, this is great hearing all of these art names, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about as an editor, I was always impressed with, there's a list of artists that I associate with you bringing to Vertigo. You've already named a couple of great artists, but some of the people
and by
on
the
my
way,
list,
I'm going to call them cartoonists. Go ahead.
fair enough.
Cartoonist too, Jim.
But Paul Pope, Gilbert Hernandez, James Jean for cover artist of Fables, Becky Cloonan, Dave Lapham, Mike Allred, Darwin Cook, Gerard Way. Like it's incredible the artists that you it may not be their first work, but I associate with some of the artists that you worked with at Vertigo. So what's that like as an editor? Were your practices different than other editors in terms of how you found talent?
I'd like to think so, without sounding like I've got a gigantic ego and all of my windows are going to crack. I brought a film and visual aesthetic to editing. I always, of course, story is important. I learned in screenwriting class, action is character. You learn all these basic things, but ultimately, what moves you? What will jump off the page and wrap its arms around me and linger in my heart and my head? That moves me, that inspires me. So I think I just had more in common with artists than many of the writers. I think that one of the greatest things I can say about working with Karen, especially in the early days when she was the editor and I was the assistant or the associate, was that she was much more interested in the writer-driven material. And I would come into the fold and I'd say, wait a minute, let's go for a double-page spread. What about the page turn? I want a splash in every issue. Or what about the 2/3 spread? I came up with things that I made up, I'm sure, but things that worked for me in terms of pacing and in terms of color on the page. But all of that stuff was only important to me because I loved film and I loved TV and I loved graphic images, so everything was important to me. The logo design, the cover. I wasn't necessarily into photo covers, to be honest. I liked more of the graphic pop art covers. And it must be said, with Milton Glaser passing, and I'm certain you guys were going to bring up his name, but the one thing that I'll always take with me that I learned from Milton Glaser, which was that his theory for covers is that there are 3 reactions to a cover: yes, no, and wow. And I might be confusing that. I might have paraphrased it a little bit, but you always want to strive for wow. So if you see a cover sketch and it's not a wow, don't commission it yet. You always need to feel that rush. And I guess I feel like with a lot of the cartoonists I work with, like Gilbert Hernandez and Paul Pope, I was a fan of their work. And so convincing them to bring their story ideas to Vertigo, to me, was just like, I want books with my name on them that I'm proud of, that I feel I'm a part of. And I just wanted to share the styles and the themes and the things that make people that move me tick. And I wanted to move away from anything that was expected. I always like to pride myself on being sort of an innovator, or if you're a Jam fan, the whole phrase about the young idea has always been interesting to me. And I've always been a sucker for coming of age and teenage wasteland and teenage, like formative years. So I always wanted that to be extra, like, clear in my work. And of course, just British pop culture. You know, I feel like I came of age in the 90s. I was 26, but I was like starting my life in New York. I devoted myself to making comics 24/7. Weekends I would spend on St. Mark's Place. I'd go to Sounds and buy records. I'd go to St. Mark's Comics and buy comics. I'd go to Kim's Video until it closed at 1 a.m. I'd buy my clothes at Trash and Vaudeville. And then I would go home, you know, I'd jump in a cab so I wouldn't get abducted. And I would, you know, that would be my money would be spent on the cab ride home, so that I could spend all Saturday night and Sunday just devouring just the amazing, like pop culture, like ephemera that I collected. And I would want to imbue that in my comics. And I really hope that love of like graphic design and just popular culture showed in all the books I edited. I was a part of that whole Brit pop movement. I always loved, I'm an Anglophile since 1974 when I discovered Bowie. I might have mentioned once or twice that I'm a big Joe Strummer fan. So I wanted to bring the what was happening in London and in England into my books. And so I was always inspired by British cartoonists. And I think Deadline magazine really was created for me. And when I saw Glenn Dillon and Philip Bond's work, I think I saw Deadline at the same time I discovered their work on Shade. Of all the books I worked on the first year, and I was a big Grant Morrison fan, I read Doom Patrol, and I thought that was a masterclass, and I still do. I think Grant's Doom Patrol and Richard Case's Doom Patrol are a masterclass in comic books, especially how to write a single issue. But the book that stole my heart was Shade the Changing Man. I think the day that I set eyes on Philip and Glenn's fill-in issues, I loved Chris Pichello. And watching Chris Pichello evolve from Shade #1 through Shade 50 is also a masterclass in storytelling and in finding your art style, because there's no one that I think developed over a 3 or 4 year period quite like Chris Pichello. I mean, he was good in the beginning, but he was masterful at the end, and he still is. As much as I love Chris, and he's still one of my favorite people in comics, Philip and Glenn were these young British guys with swagger. And that's what I saw on the page, and my eyeballs popped out. And I was like, I want these two guys to draw every comic I edit from now on until forever. But little did I know I would marry one of them. Could you imagine?
Shelley, I want to know, was it a tough sell to the administration at DC when you started to pitch names like Paul Pope and Gilbert Hernandez and Dave Lapham? Because like your bibliography is extremely impressive to me, and I was always excited to see a new DC book from one of the indie creators that like I totally adored. Like the trajectory for a person in my peer group would have been to discover these cartoonists in Palmer's Picks, in Wizard Magazine, go seek out THB, go seek out Stray Bullets, and then a couple years later, one after the other, they start getting these DC Vertigo books, Heavy Liquid, Young Liars, like all that stuff. Was there pushback?
Well, you know, there wasn't huge pushback from Karen. I think once I convinced Karen I knew what I was doing, she was almost relieved because she had so much to juggle. I mean, she was building this imprint, and once she knew she could trust me. I have to give her some props there. You know, she was pretty much a supporter of just about everything that I wanted to do for the imprint. I think when it comes to Gilbert Hernandez, you know, Karen and I had very different reading tastes. We had very different art heroes, I guess. So I think that the balance was good. When it came to Stray Bullets, that's one of my favorite stories. Anyone who knows me knows that if there's a gun to my head and I'm told I have to name my favorite comic, and this is since 1995, by the way, no offense to any of the comics you guys have done or any of the comics my husband has done, but one favorite comic forever, Stray Bullets, no contest. When I read that first issue, and I like couldn't believe how raw and real it was. And I just like felt like at that moment I was going to be a comics lifer. And working with David, it was many years later that I worked with David, but I remember going over to him at a convention and just shaking his hand and just being like, Stray Bullets is my favorite comic. Bye. You know, just like any other fan, I'd just be like, see ya. Thanks for doing it. And I'm sure he thought I was just some kind of nerd girl. But the story about how I convinced David to work for Vertigo, of course I, wanted him to do something. And I had heard he was working for Bob Schreck on Batman. And I was like, okay, that's cool. He's doing Batman, but I wanted to do something for Vertigo. And I will never forget this as long as I live. I saw Bob Schreck. It was a cold night and I had to walk home. I was all bundled up. I would have a hood and gloves and a scarf and a muff to walk 2 blocks home, 9:30 at night, dead of winter. I see Bob Schreck in the elevator and I'm like, Bob, hey, I've been enjoying David Lapham's work on Batman. How cool, props. He's like, oh yeah, he just finished his run. And I went, stop the elevator. What? He's like, yeah, we just wrapped up. Yeah, he's a good guy. I'm like, what's his phone number? I made Bob give me his phone number. I rip off my hood. I rip off my hat. I'm like, Bob, I have to call him now. And I literally went back to my desk and I felt like I was crawling through glass. And I was like pushing my way through the smog to get to the phone to be like, David Lapham, Shelley Bond, I heard you finished Batman. What would you like to do for Vertigo? Stray Bullets is my favorite comic since 1995. I think you're a genius. I would love for you to pitch me something. I'm not even sure if I let him answer. I might have just hung up the phone and walked home and I was been like, damn. But yeah, after that, he pitched me quite a few things and we started with Silverfish, which to this day is one of my favorite self-contained hardcover black and white books I've ever worked on. After Silverfish, convincing Karen to do Young Liars was tough. I'm not going to lie. Silverfish didn't do well for us and I was just gutted. And I was really, really convinced that Young Liars was just going to blow people away because it was so frenetic and it was immediate. And I really wanted to do a monthly with him. I really wanted him to work at that pace because I knew he could. And it was all about music and it was about a girl who had a bullet lodged in her brain. In fact, it started out as Bullet Girl. We were told at one point that they wanted us to take a few names from the back catalogs and come up with like new properties. And so I always loved the name Bullet Girl. So I said to David Lapham, my God, let's do it as Bullet Girl. Of course that was shot down. So that's a moment where the upper echelon said, nope, can't do it. So it turned out to be better for David because by calling it Young Liars, it was a creator-owned book and it was going to be his story and art anyway. So it really was better for him in the long run. But I'll never forget the moment when I gave the pitch to Karen and she just was like, she just sat there and she just shook her head. She's like, look, we really had a hard time selling Silverfish, but I know how you feel about him. I'm going to approve it. And she like just rolled her eyes at me and I was like, yes, I'm not going to let you down. This is going to be amazing. You're going to love this. And I know she still didn't get it. But I think it's cool that she let us have 3 trade paperbacks. We went to issue 18, which is still a hell of a run, especially in this market. And so I'll never forget that. Like, I'd say 85% of the time, Karen was like super into what it would pitch her. And she was a big fan of Paul Pope's pitches, and she certainly encouraged him for both Heavy Liquid and 100%. But I'll always thank Karen for just giving me another David Lapham book because I'm super proud. Although if I can say one thing, she didn't approve Lodger. And I pitched that to her right before she left. And she didn't get it. And she also said no, like a hard, cold no, because Young Liars obviously didn't sell that well. But I wasn't going to let that get me down because I think I learned the hard way over the years that if someone rejects your idea, that's just their prerogative. You can't take it personally. Um, she was inspired by different people. That's fine. I knew I would resurrect it one day. So when I was doing Black Crown, I held out an olive branch to David Lapham. I'm like, hey, ever think about Lodger? Why don't we make it happen now? And I think it actually benefited from 5 or 6 years later to revisit the pitch. The bones of the story about a serial killer are still there. But I think what it's become now in the age of social media that works on a different level made it a stronger book. And David got nominated for an Eisner for that book and for Best Writer, Best Artist in 2018. So I'm super proud of what Black Crown did for Lodger. And working with David and Maria, who I found out is also, quite talented in the writing department. That's just, it's been one of my greatest accomplishments, I think, in comics.
We should take it
Did
to
I answer the
Black.
question?
Yes, absolutely. Can we talk about Black Crown
Sure.
and the genesis of that imprint? How did that come about?
So after I left DC in 2016, the short story is that I was doing a lot of new monthlies at Vertigo. I had hoped we could sort of seed them in. It was really hard to tell at that time what the marketplace wanted from new books. Vertigo hadn't had a hit in many years. I think Y and Fables, when Sandman ended, Y and Fables really carried the line and allowed us to do a lot of those really cool indie books, the ones that you've mentioned, and many, many others. American Virgin, I have to give props to that, and House of Secrets, and Dead Enders. I think Ed Brubaker's career started off with a bang. I loved his navel gazing with Low Life, but I think it was on Prez where I think he really showed his stuff. Lou Stathis hired him on Prez with Eric Schanauer, and that blew me away. And so when Lou passed away, I didn't want any of Lou's people to just get shafted. So I called Ed Brubaker right away, and I was like, Ed, I love your stuff, pitch me. And so he pitched me Scene of the Crime. And then, of course, he'd worked with Michael Lark and Sean Phillips on that. But I also worked with Howard Chaykin because Lou Stathis wanted to do a book with Howard Chaykin. And I thought Howard Chaykin was a jackass, by the way. I read Howard's editorials in Black Kiss, and I didn't even realize Lou edited Black Kiss, and I thought Howard was such a jackass. But of course, I reached out to Howard, didn't tell him that, but told him that I knew that he was going to work with Lou, and I wanted him to pitch me anything he wanted to pitch Lou. And that's how American Century happened. And of course, I grew to adore Howard. And Howard also is a tremendous draftsman and graphic storyteller and wordsmith. So that's something that I'm glad I can share with you guys. And I know that you guys have had Howard on and you adore Howard. And I love telling people the reason that I called Howard. And it really wasn't because of American Flag. And it wasn't because of Black Kiss, because I wasn't a Black Kiss fan. In fact, I thought it was vile for quite a long time until I went back and looked at it in a different way. So that's a story you probably haven't heard. That segues to Black Crown, because when I left DC, I left Vertigo pretty much in good hands with Gerard Way, because Gerard and I were working on Young Animal, which I'm sure you guys know, and you had him on your show, so you know what just a triple threat he is. Amazing person, terrific artist, jaw-dropping writer. And I have to tell you that he was an intern when I was editing The Invisibles, and he was a super huge fan of Grant Morrison's. And the only thing I remember about Gerard when he was an intern was that he was a kid who sometimes would be on our floor carrying a stack of papers. And I kind of vaguely remember he would peer inside my office. So I didn't remember him. I was a total editing art snob. Did not remember him as anything other than a DCU intern, whatever. But when I heard he was writing comics, I thought, okay, this is interesting. When I heard he was a rock star, I thought, okay, great. Somebody is going to give a dilettante a job writing comics because he's a big rock star. he's probably a total poser. So I read his work expecting it to be absolutely awful. And I could not believe my eyes. I could not believe how strong his early work was. And I thought, damn, I am so wrong. I want to work with him so badly. So we started talking, and I had no idea that like he thought I was like a rock star editor. And I think that was like the first time I actually heard the term rock star editor. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. Because when I was editing The Invisibles, I think that's the job that put me on the map, because I was tasked with taking what Grant Morrison pitched to Karen Berger as a trilogy and taking volume 1, which was edited by Stuart Moore, who also edited Preacher and was kind of off doing the Helix line. I was tasked to actually make it sell so that they wouldn't have to end it at volume 2, because Grant envisioned it as a trilogy. So Karen had said to me, would you like to edit the book? And I, of course, like, oh my God, Grant was like my hero. I was like, yes. But she said, you know, you really have like a serious job ahead of you because you're in sales and et cetera, et cetera. So I came in and I said, all right, I'm going to make it my own, and I'm going to make it Britpop. And so the first thing I did was fire people. I fired the letterer, Clem Robbins, who I adore, by the way, but who's never forgiven me. But love him as a person. But I was like, if I'm on the book, Todd Klein's going to letter it, because Todd had more of a pop art sensibility. And I said, if I'm going to edit the book, I'm going to completely have a new cover artist, and I'm going to change the logo, because you needed to have something that was wholly different. It needed to be a 180 from volume 1, or it wasn't going to survive. So I ended up firing Sean Phillips, whose covers I loved, who was a great friend of mine, who would come to New York and we'd go hang out in the Village. But, you know, that phone call wasn't easy, but it had to be done. And so I know I mentioned that early on in our chat, but if you want to be an editor and you don't have the balls to fire someone, don't be an editor, because you are going to pussyfoot around for years and years, and you are going to make mediocre art. That's the rule number 1. You have to be bossy. You can say it nicely, but you have to make decisions that make sense for the book and the story. Full stop. So you have to take your friendship out of it. You have to take everything out of it except for your mission at hand, which is to make everybody on the team look good and also hold people accountable. That's the other main tenet of comic book editing, is that you have to hold people accountable, and it starts with you. It starts with you as the editor, treating people with respect, treating people like you want to be treated. To segue back to Black Crown, so when I left, I knew that Gerard knew what he was doing. You know, we set up Young Animal. I edited a few issues of the Doom Patrol, which, let's face it, that's what Gerard Way was born to write. And Gerard and I talked about that years before Young Animal was even an imprint name, which was all Gerard's, by the way. But Gerard and I talked about Doom Patrol many years before that. While he was on a plane, I think to Japan, he was writing me emails about ideas he had. And we always thought it would be so amazing for him to take the proverbial baton from where Grant and Richard Case's Doom Patrol ended and then just run with it, you know, like just take off. So believe me when I tell you, I was thrilled that I could help him set up, you know, the entire line, including Shade the Changing Girl, which I knew Cecil Castellucci and Marley Zarconi were like sisters separated at birth. I worked with them both extensively, and I was shocked they didn't know each other, and I was shocked I hadn't introduced them, like even just so they could talk about like fashion. Like it blew my mind. So putting them together on paper was a no-brainer. So it was funny because when I left DC, they eliminated my position for some reason, and I was like okay with that. And I walked out the door. I just knew Gerard was just going to like nail it. Like he was just going to take it. And that to me was vertigo. Like anything else that was left over was gray. You know, it wasn't, the Vertigo lost its patina and its luster many years before that. And I just knew whatever Young Animal was, that was the spirit. You know, I left the spirit. I left the fire baton in Gerard's hand, and he blew me away. And I'm really happy that he was able to like at least see his vision through. Black Crown started on the day that I left DC, because I got an email from someone named Chris Ryle, whose name was familiar. I knew IDW, I thought they were a licensed publisher. I knew they were in San Diego, but that's it. But I got an email from Chris Ryle, and he said, Shelly, I followed your books since you started at Vertigo. I'm a big fan. I'm really sad that your job was eliminated. If you want to stay in comics, please reply to this email. If not, best of luck. I'm sure you'll do great in whatever you do. And that was the only email from someone I didn't know in the industry. And I thought, I'm going to remember this guy. So I wrote back. I said, look, I can't even shop my resume for 6 months. I'm under contract. But you're going to get my first resume as soon as I am allowed to procure new work. And so I spent 6 months having an absolute ball. I couldn't work in the industry. So I read comics. I started working on my memoir, which Jim can attest to, because Jim and his wife, Natalie, gave me the best notes on my first draft of the proposal, which I, to this day, Jim, have copied and I look at as I work on it. I went to the library and I read comics and I wrote comics, and I just had a lot of fun because I was getting severance and I needed to let off some steam. And I also wanted to catch up on things that I couldn't do because my life had been spent 24/7 for 23 and a half years making comics. And I needed to take a deep breath. I was tap dancing at least 3 or 4 times a week, which was great. I was exercising. I felt great. I was having fun. I was also crafting my next move, and that next move was Black Crown. And so I basically got in touch with Chris, and I said, look, I've got an imprint. I'm not sure what you want. And he said, I want a SHELLY Bond imprint. And I was like, all right. So I pitched him Black Crown. I sent him the 2 or 3 page draft, and he said, I love it. And I was really expecting to get copious notes. You know, I had a notebook ready, and I said, okay, which one do you like of the ideas? And he said, no, I like it all. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, why don't you come meet with the other bosses and let's talk about when you can actually start working here. And I said, the only catch is that I can't move from Los Angeles. My son loves school out here. We already yanked him out of his school. He was in 4th grade on the East Coast. He's, you know, I don't want to uproot him again. He said, oh, you can work remotely. And I was like, what? So to this day, I will tell you that my best boss in comics is Chris Ryle, because I think that in 3 years, both Philip and I delivered exactly what we wanted to create for him, which is basically our love for music and comics and an indie record label for IDW. And we have no regrets. And we put out 10 trades, thousands of pages in record timing. And not one of those books do we have second thoughts about or have any regrets. And I think Chris feels the same way. We just couldn't find the right audience. The books cost so much money to make because they printed in Korea. I wasn't going to settle for any less, you know, high production values. They had to look and feel beautiful. You know, it was really, really hard to make money on books that we spent that much money on, to the point where I actually taught myself how to letter. Because as much as I loved Aditya Bidikar, who was our house letterer the first year, we had to start cutting costs. And I couldn't pay Addy less than his worth. And so it was just pretty clear that I either had to work with in-house letterers or I had to learn how to do it myself. So I did the latter because I also am a frustrated art director and graphic designer. So I thought this was a really good way to save the company money and actually learn the craft. So there you have it.
You mentioned the trouble, you know, finding that audience, but I wonder what your impressions are of kind of the comics landscape now, you know, the present state of comics as you see them.
The present state of comics is the sky's the limit. I am frustrated by editors today who are so lazy. You know, now I have the luxury of freelancing right now. I'm editing Bitterroot, which I have to give props to my team. It's such a great joy to work on a book that you respect so much, that is not only entertaining. I mean, come on, like Monster Hunters during the Harlem Renaissance, drawn by, if I can say this, the most talented working artist of 2020, Sanford Greene. I mean, the guy is just phenomenal. I can't say enough great things about him as an artist and a person. The artistry is supreme. The whole team, Chuck Brown and David F. Walker as the writers, Sophie Dodgson, who is a colorist, who is recently on the scene over the past few years, she is going to clean up the awards. She is probably the one talent that I think that I discovered through Sanford, who is taking names right now, who's a tremendous designer as well. She designed the Insider Art logo, by the way. I think right now, there are a lot of lazy editors out there. I see them on Twitter. They say, hey, who's popular? You know, who's popular is who you're going to find. And just open up your eyes. You have people across the globe who are self-publishing, who are putting their work on Gumroad digitally, who are kickstarting. You find people by still going to conventions. We talked about the Cala Arts Fest, SPX. Clearly during the pandemic, we're not doing it as much, but there are virtual conventions. Broken Frontier is such a wonderful resource, astounding British talents. There's a renaissance in female artists right now, and they're here. I mean, this is not just a shameless self-promotion. This is me doing the job for every editor in comics right now. There are 142 talents in here. Most of them you do not know. Reach in your pocket, pull out a tenner. You know, like give up the coffee you don't need. That costs about 10 bucks these days. Donate to a good cause, and what you're getting is a Bible. And I did that also for Hey Amateur. You know, the Kickstarters I do, they're chock full of well-known people. You know, like I had Jim Rugg, who did a great essay in Hey Amateur, by the way. You have well-known people. You have Gail Simone. You have a lot of comics favorites. And then you have newcomers. You know, I'm making these things. This is like a 101. Assistant editors, impress your bosses. I'm giving you, it's like handing someone a Rolodex. So the state of comics today, I'm disgusted by the lack of diversity. I'm horrified that we're in the same place we were 4 years ago with not having enough representation and not enough voices. And if you look at how women and people are treated in the industry, facing not only sexism and chauvinism, but ageism. I mean, you know, do the math. Look at all of the really important comics professionals who have been aged out. This is why we don't have really strong editors. I shouldn't say that across the board. There are certainly some very talented editors out there. I don't know too many, and I'd like to get to know more. But right now, I think the best thing people can do is open up their eyes, do the work. You know, in the old days, I would go to Hanley's Universe, I would go to Forbidden Planet, I would go to St. Mark's Comics. On the weekends, I would tear through every comic. If I liked it, I probably loved it. And I'd be calling those people. You know, it's like how Minx actually had a lot of interesting indie artists. I mean, if you think about Sophie Campbell, you know, she did Water Baby. My God, that was groundbreaking back then. Derek Kirk Kim, you know, he had a book called Same Difference. Anything that I liked, I loved. And Jim, you know, meeting you at Mocha was how I actually discovered Street Angel. And, you know, you go to shows, you trust your instinct. And I think if most editors are honest, they want to work on projects and stories and books that they want to read. And for me, I like appropriation a lot, but I want to see what you bring to an old trope. I want to see much more than the things that everyone else is doing. I'm always looking for something unexpected. And I feel like now is the best time to make comics. And there are no excuses. I think that a lot of people sit around and think deep thoughts who want to write comics. They should sit down and write. I think a lot of editors spend a lot of their days watching Netflix. And I've seen those people in big offices, and that's what they do. And they're not studying the layouts or talking to their artists. Editing is a lost art when people can't pick up the phone or actually have a video conference call. If they're just sending in emails back to their artists saying, thanks, got it, and not checking in on their schedules and not giving people deadlines. Editing is making yourself accountable and making your teams accountable and bringing everything in on time to make a beautiful end product and tell a story that lasts and lasts. So the time is now. It's the best time to be in comics.
And once again, Insider Art, the Gumroad link is going to be in the video description below this on YouTube.
I have a couple of final things to show. I brought a little envelope here. We did a little promotion called the Vertigo Rave, and I saved so many of these cool little pieces. We had this great little rave flyer, which I just wanted to show for any old Vertigo fans. But I was looking through my makes folder, and I found in a copy of Teen Magazine, I found this beautiful spread by someone named Jim Rugg, who was just a kid back then, but he did my launch book, The Plain Janes. He did an astounding job on that book, and I know Jim probably has shown off the original book, but I wanted to just hold up what was our little sampler, which I'm so proud of. You know, even though the line only lasted for 2 years, and by the way, they ended the line on my birthday, but who remembers things like that? They didn't really give it a chance, which is a shame, but I'm glad that all these years later, people are waking up to the fact that, like, the young adult reader is the most powerful reader right now in book publishing. So go Raina Telgemeier. Talk about somebody who's the most important person to comics. My apologies to Frank Miller, but it's Raina Telgemeier. I mean, how great is it, Jim, that you were able to get 2 books? So at least we had the first 2 Janes, and now you have the 3rd Janes. You have the collection out.
It is. I love that sampler too. As you're flipping through it, it was printed on newsprint. That was the coolest book. I always liked how that felt. That was a fun one to give away. And Sophie Campbell's story, the one that you have open right there, it is one of those beautiful, beautiful comics and you know, worth seeking out for people at home. About a surfer who survives a shark attack. Like it's a badass story.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a shame. I think that so many people that started out in comics got their first break through Minx. Mariko Tamaki actually had written Skim, which, Jim, I have to give you props. When I met you at SPX, I asked you to give me some pointers on who I should check out, and you told me to go check out Jillian Tamaki's work. So I picked up Skim, and I immediately fell in love with Mariko Tamaki's cadence and hired her to do Amiko Superstar with Steve Ralston. But it's like a who's who here, if you think about it. Token by Elisa Whitney and Joelle Jones was a terrific book, and that was just a little from the sampler. We also had, of course, Brian Wood and Ryan Kelly, who were doing quite a bit in indie comics on local at the time. They did the New York 4. And I think another person that came out of that was Iñaki Miranda, who I paired up with a novelist, and they did Burnout, which, you know, Iñaki went on to have a very distinguished career at DC Comics. He did quite a few things for me at Vertigo, but then he went on to do Catwoman and was definitely one of their go-to artists. So if there's one thing that I'd love to do is to find that person who really has the talent and really isn't afraid to put in the work. Because that's the other thing as an editor, I have to say, when you see that raw bit of talent, you know, it's one thing to say, hey, I would love to work with you and help you hone your skills, but it's another thing for people to actually have the guts to work with someone where they're going to work you to death. And I think, Jim, you can attest to the fact that, like, sometimes I'm not easy. And it doesn't matter if you've done 2 pages for me or 200 pages for me, or if you've written 6 scripts for me. If you're you're going to get a rewrite and you're going to be asked to redo a hand if it's not foreshortened correctly, or if the script is way too wordy. Mike Carey will always tell the story how he worked with me on Lucifer, and issue 3 had as many rewrites as sometimes issue 23. It was not approved until it was right, until it was done. And so that's the kind of editor I am. And I guess I'll equate it to like conducting a symphony. Like, everyone needs to be working at the top of their game. And if there's something wrong with the story, I'll lift it up like the hood of a car. Neil Gaiman once said I would lift up the hood of a car and I'd, like a mechanic, I would fix what was wrong. But I think that that's a really good analogy for what editing is. It's a lot of things, you know, and it's part traffic cop, it's part psychiatrist, it's part, you know, train conductor, it's part ego buster or ego tamer. But most of all, it's the art of collaborating with other people from around the world and bringing like-minded people together to bring a story to life in the best way possible on the page.
Well said. I think we have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for joining us, Shelley. This has been very insightful, and hopefully we'll have you back on again whenever the next big project rolls through. And until then, you know, best of luck with Insider Art. You know, again, links below this video. I was blown away by it. So hopefully quite a few Kayfabers will find some new favorite cartoonists in there as well.
Can we give one shout out to Lola, the illustrator, and Cindy Whitehead?
Yes, two of my favorites from Insider Art. We should say Cindy Whitehead, who has been kind of one of my mentors over the last couple of years, Hall of Fame vertical skateboarder from the 70s, amazing. The creator behind Girl Is Not a Four-Letter Word. And Lola, the illustrator, I think she just turned 11.
She has turned 12.
She's turned 12, has done art demos in Apple stores to give some framework of her success as a barely 12-year-old illustrator, but very fantastic.
Shelley, what are some social media links that people can get in touch with you, follow you, keep up with your progress and everything?
Oh, absolutely. So on Twitter, I'm at SX Bond. On Instagram, I'm at SX Imprimatur. I'm on Facebook. And also, neither of you guys like mentioned anything about the dress code. Like, not one person like commented on my badass t-shirt.
Well, that goes without saying, though.
All right.
More proof of your great taste.
I thought we were all going to wear matching shirts today. I went for the yellow one. By the way, again, I don't mind. Shameless plug for your merchandise. I bought my husband a shirt for Father's Day from his son with the Kayfabe approved by the Kayfabe code. Yes. So, by the way, bought him the gray shirt. And for me, it was no contest. I was going for the yellow because to me, it was classic. 100% yellow, people. Check out the merchandise for Kayfabe on Teespring.
Take that, David Cho.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Shelley, it was a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys for having me.